All right, we will start it. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues and distinguished speakers. Welcome to the roundtable. My name is Li Lu. My colleague Albert Valentine and I will facilitate this session. The theme of this roundtable is models of cooperation with management practice. And we also have two sub-themes: conversation with executives, how research can improve business practice; discussion with executives, how business practice can enhance research impact, vice versa. And Albert and I prepare a brief description trying to make an introduction to of each speaker, but then we find out their resume and it is just too long. So we decide to save time. Since each of them bring their own PowerPoint for presentation. So if you are interested, you should, and you can search online. You can get so much information about each speakers. And the sequence of the speaker's presentation for today, starting with Dr. Matt Morstein, followed with Dr. Willem Glick, Dr. Denise Russell, Dr. T.V. Raw, Dr. Julapong Nacharsi, and Dr. Sim Sticky. So we're going to turn the floor to Dr. Morstein, and when they all finish their presentation, we will have our roundtable discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we will reserve 20 minutes for Q&A. And please welcome Dr. Morstein.
Thank you very much for this warm welcome, and I'm very excited to be part of the IFSAM conference. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone around here. So I decided to spend and I'll just share my slide here. I hope you can see my screen. So I decided to spend my first few minutes to focus on that part of higher education that is the research-based education, because I truly believe that via our education, we also have a huge potential to engage with business practice and to be informed by and to inform business and management. So let me start with this slide that I labeled 1 of 3. So that reminds us and calls our attention to actually 30% of the world's higher education students study business management and economics. 30%, 1 of 3 students that graduate with an undergraduate degree or graduate degree in the world each year. This is about 70 million graduates per year, and it makes business the globally largest field of higher education studies by far. I've been looking for this number for quite a while, and I was happy that I've sort of urged my team to find the number, and we found it deep down somewhere in UNESCO's statistics. So let's just remind ourselves how important, how influential, how impactful business economics management studies are for to set the tone in business and in research and in decision making. I just looked at recently at what are the new leadership skills demands from businesses, and the top skills of 2025 here. This is not some leftish survey report coming out. This is from the World Economic Forum, pointing our attention to the need for our students as they become decision makers to be apt at reasoning, problem solving, ideation, analytical thinking and innovation, active learning and learning strategies, complex problem solving, creativity, critical thinking, etc. Just to point our attention to that these are skills that, of course, we should ask ourselves to what extent we, in our education, in our research-based education, to what extent do we bring that to those 1 of 3 students that we graduate each year. When I look upon in my current role as head of Prime principles for responsible management education, when I look upon the curriculum that is being brought into, say, mainstream universities in the global context of the Sustainable Development Goals and the dire challenges that we know in the world, I've just brought a few pictures here for us to sort of stimulate the discussion. What I'm still a little amazed to see is that business schools, we are still teaching our students that success is about short-term, it's about shareholder supremacy, it is a mimicking the market rather than transforming social reality. It is encouraging our students to have a quick income increase because that will give them a high salary, but it will also help us as business schools in the rankings to increase there. And we are, by some of our own colleagues, and I'm here quoting Professor Ghoshal and Professor Khurana from Harvard University and Harvard Business School, we are educating mere craftsmen and not citizens of the world. And I think that this sort of poses a bit of a self-critical reflection upon us. How do we engage in improving that and actually educating those students and that research that is needed for the world, for the improvement of the world? What we focus on in Prime is three things, and I'd like to return to that in our conversation later, what I call 3S. The first has to do with we need to review how we define success in our research and in our leadership education programs. What does it mean to be a successful business? What does it mean to be a successful business leader? 2, we need to review the skill sets, not only the skills that we know we need to improve the skill sets of our students and you know, the kind of skill set that the survey from WIF is asking for as we graduate our students, but also the skill set among ourselves as educators. I personally never received 1 hour of training to be a trainer, to be educated, to become an educator during my 20 years as professor on in different settings in the world. So we need to focus on the skill set of our faculty, our professors. Are they skilled to do more than profess the cognitive knowledge, or are they also skilled to actually train social interpersonal dynamics amongst our students, for example? Finally, I want us to pay attention to the South. I've had the privilege of traveling a bit in the South over the past year, and I hear a lot of fabulous solutions to some of the dire climate change implications that is happening, and particularly dire in the South. But the South and the business schools and the professors and even the students are saying, we face the consequences of climate change, but we also have the solutions. So we need to learn from each other. I think that the North maybe also wants to learn from the South. So basically what we are focused, this is my last slide, what we are focusing on is the curriculum change, it's the skill set development, it's the practical relevance, and practical relevance, I'm talking about practical and relevant. If you are in the global North, if you are in the United States, there's a practical relevance that has to do with that local context and that geographical space on the world. If you are in Africa, this may look very different. So we need to be able to have research and educational material that is relevant wherever we are in the world. And of course, the global impact. And that's my final comment here, that I think that we as business schools, as management researchers, have a task for ourselves to be able to account much better for how we actually, because I believe we very much do, contribute to societal impact for the world. I think that our friends and our colleagues in the engineering sciences and in the natural sciences have been much better at making that global impact they provide visible for the rest of the world. I think we still have some work to do from the management sciences. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Matt Morsi. This is really a huge task. We have a common goal, and please I would like to invite Professor William Glick, and after each speaker's presentation, we can have discussion about how we can collaborate.
And thank you very much. Thank you, Mette, for setting this up very nicely. One of the things I was reflecting on as I was preparing for this session was how the conversation has changed pretty dramatically over the recent years to really think more clearly about our role as faculty members in society. And the 1 in 3 is an important message to carry forward, but I'd also say that it underestimates our potential impact overall. But before I jump into that, I think there is more of a common understanding at this point that too much of our research does not really have the type of impact that we'd like it to have, or the potential that it could have. And I'd like to take one particular perspective on that, which is to take a look at following money. So as a former dean, I was particularly struck by where does our money come from? Where does it go? And by and large, most of the money comes from tuition. In some areas, it's much more government funding, and you can throw in a little bit of philanthropy to help it. But by and large, that is intended for education. And off on the sides, there's some government and philanthropy money that goes into research, but it's pretty small potatoes by comparison to everything else. When you take a look at the big picture, there's over $4 billion a year globally spent on research. And there's several different calculations for doing that, but it comes out to about 4 billion a year, which is pretty big in my perspective. And that raises huge questions about why are we diverting, or how can we be diverting so much money from education to research, in many cases without society being fully aware of it? And how do we make sure that we can create as much societal impact, as much impact on education as possible out of those research dollars? So that's sort of the challenge. And the general consensus within responsible research and business and management group has been that an awful lot of it's the incentives. It's a complex, interconnected system, but you have to change the incentives if you're going to get it to change throughout. And so how do we do that? So we start off with awards. If you have awards, oddly enough, faculty will respond. So at this point, we are now in the position of having some announcements about awards for publications that are credible and useful from all the major disciplines within business. And then we also have done it in a number of other fashions, most importantly, probably pushing the conversation, where there have been so many articles, presentations, summits, webinars, et cetera, have come out around this topic that there's plenty of visibility. And certainly the conversation has taken over a lot more people than just the people in responsible research. We've also been successful in getting ACSB on board with new accreditation standards, putting a big emphasis on societal impact. EFMD has both this type of bent within their EQUIS accreditation standards, as well as their BSIS, which is to measure the impact of the school. We've also launched some scholarships for dissertations. And then more recently, we've launched the Responsible Research in Business and Management Honor Roll. And that is intended to provide recognition for anybody who's got, or for any publications rather, that are credible and useful. And the key piece there is, are they going to have some societal impact? And we've got a review process set up for looking at that. And I'd strongly encourage people to take a look at that and nominate their recent articles or any publications for the honor roll. I'll post this in a chat here shortly. And then I think there's still plenty of opportunities for doing more. One of the obvious ones is having a closer link between what we do in terms of research and what goes on in the classroom, particularly research that can have a broader societal impact. And then there's also, coming out of our research roundtable last year, a good deal of energy around trying to create some type of collaborative structures for knowledge co-production. And I know some of the other speakers are really masters at doing this, but it's a type of thing that if we can create the right structures, I think we can help to facilitate a lot more collaboration and engagement between academics and the rest of society. So that's one area where and we can talk about that later, but one area where I think there's a lot of opportunity. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass the baton.
Thank you, Professor Glick, with your excellent experience when you were former dean of Rice University. You raised $65 million between 2005 and 2016 and changed the curriculum of the business school and initiate 5 in the new programs. I learned this from website. I'm very intrigued by what you are doing, and you continue to develop this business model and very successful. And you focus recognition and publication and research scholarship, and also the standardization. One of my PhD students, he applied the scholarship, he didn't get it. But I know he is too rushed, but that is fantastic incentive for PhD students. I hope you can have more, small amount, more opportunities. Okay, we can have a discussion later, and let's welcome Professor Denise Russo.
Yeah, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Let me set this up appropriately. Gonna move my slideshow. There we go. I'll play from start. Gotta give you a bigger picture to look at, I think. There we go. All right. So I'm going to take this it's related to what Meta and Bill have talked previously, but I'm going to take it into the relationship between scholars and practitioners and talk about that. And I'll just confess right up front that the reason I have slides is that everybody else has slides, and I didn't want to be the weenie who didn't have the legitimation of some visuals for you, but I'm going to tell you a couple of stories to flesh out the points I'm making. So, and my tale, what I'm trying to describe for you, is kind of framed around the issue of the thought worlds that we, I think, see today to a great extent between management practitioners and management scholars. And when I say practitioners, they could be managers. These are organizational people running teams, making decisions about their staff, managing their bosses, trying to make a local change. Practitioner large. And scholars, the scholars can be psychologists, economists, strategy folks, negotiations people, social psychologists, broadly. Okay, so I'm talking in general categories, but nonetheless, I will assert that to a great extent, these communities reflect largely different thought worlds, different assumptions about what matters, different assumptions about what they should do, different sets of expectations and goals. And that's really an important kind of starting point, because the idea of building quality relationships between these is some sort of at least integration or fluency in communication between the thought worlds. And I'm going to assert, because I think I'm the oldest person here, so you get some points for this. It didn't always used to be like this, that these thought worlds were so different. Okay, so you remember when business schools were first started, I'm thinking Joseph Wharton in particular, they were started because it was believed that if we educated managers, they would be more ethical and they would make decisions based on better quality information. That was Wharton's goal. It's interesting what their purposes might be now, but one of the things that's very important is that, to a great extent, management practitioners used research to as part of everyday life in the early part of the 20th century. And you can think about scientific management practices as research done on your own organization. And organizations had research units that studied how things were done, and they partnered with academics. It was not uncommon. A good bit of early research in my own field, which is I'm an industrial psychologist by training, was field research. We didn't do experiments, and nobody ever surveyed people through the internet at the time. That people were in the field, and in that context, they were working closely with practitioners on the problems that were of interest. Now, IO psychology today, which is a field that trains most of its people go into industry, not into academics, it differs from the parallel field in management, which is organizational behavior, where very few of the people who graduate with a PhD in OB go into industry. Normative forces are at work that make it hard for practitioners today and scholars to have good knowledge exchanges, for academics to be able to understand what's of concern to the practitioner and their needs, and for the practitioner to figure out how to use the research in some way, shape, or form, should they want to, that the scholars are producing. And there's a couple of things. First, I'll say, you just don't get any respect. So the idea of, would I ever have the time to look up all this research, and why should I talk with these pie-in-the-sky ivory tower people? There is a sort of macho quality about not invented here that we will often see in practice. At the same time, scholars who do too much time, too much of a focus on practitioner issues are often dissed by their own colleagues because they're not generating theory, our golden currency. So there's kind of a disrespect in both areas for what the other does, and maybe some degree of shame accumulated by the member of each group if they spent too much time talking to the others. I think that that's actually false, that if one did have quality conversations, you as a practitioner with a researcher, you as a researcher with practitioners, your currency would go up, because managers who make decisions with evidence are respected and trusted by their peers. Scholars who have close ties with practitioners have papers that are much more highly cited and used than people who don't have those close ties. And I will say an example of that is the recent work by Rines and Bartunek, which has evaluated citations and implications for practitioners included in academic articles, and link their efficacy to the amount of time the scholar spent in the organizations of which they were studying. So that no respect thing is a problem, but it may actually be an easily resolved problem. But there's another problem, and that's the so little time problem, in that to work collaboratively, to take the time to be reflective for a practitioner, you got to take a breath, think about it, step back. To take the time to drill down into the questions that overlap between scholars and practitioners can be hard for a researcher, especially a junior researcher. It's hard to do it alone or on your own because people don't have time. But I'll tell you my story very quickly, which is when I've always done field research because I am an industrial psychologist by training. It was normal in my training. But when I took my job at Carnegie Mellon, I had kind of a problem. I had teenagers at home and I was moving to a new environment. How could I gather data without getting on an airplane? Because you can outsource the management of small children. You can hire childcare workers. You cannot outsource the raising of teenagers. The parent has to be there. You guys are knowing, it's just the way it is. And I had to be there. I had to stay in Pittsburgh. So what could I do as a scholar? What do we have in Pittsburgh? Healthcare. We have a huge healthcare complex, and I became a healthcare researcher because I didn't have to get on an airplane. And the beauty of that is by spending time in healthcare, I learned the terminology. It took me less time to get up to speed. And fortunately for me, maybe not so fortunately for us, healthcare as an entity, as a thing to study, it has the good, the bad, and the ugly of human behavior. Everything is there under one roof. But the idea, how do we find time for busy academics who do have those kids at home? And I would say that part of the issue for us, you all, us all, I've been participated in IFSAM myself years ago as a former AOM president. I know that you, and I know that the people who, the more junior colleagues in your universities are time starved. It takes a village. If we're part of a team, it's less labor intensive to go into the field. And I'm going to tell you a little story about how that can be done in a minute. But the idea of taking the time to build expertise in an organization really does pay off. And it's easier done if you have relations with the practitioners that are built through executive ed or that are supported by your business school or management school. Because of these problems, the no respect, the little time, we have a knowledge production opportunity it's a challenge because we have a deficit that we could use to add to the mix of research we produce. And I want to give you, no open question, didn't mean to surface that. There we go. Up, let me go back. Can I get rid of this little puppy on the screen? Do you guys see a no open questions thing? Or is it only me?
Top line that says the scholar practitioner gap is not unique to management.
Oh, okay. So I've got something on my screen that you don't have. That's okay. So I'll ignore it and go forward.
We've just got the slide.
Okay, hallelujah. This is good. It's all about me. What I see is reality, but I'm also old enough to know that probably isn't always true. So the critical idea here is the notion of the gap that often exists between what researchers study and what practitioners are interested in. But that's not a unique thing to management. And the idea that I would pose to you here is something that we observe in medicine. Okay, and that is the idea. This is a quote from a medical researcher who says has been a tremendous change in the I'm trying to close this in the research that we see in medicine, which previously was disease oriented. So you had people studying the basics of diabetes, and maybe you studied also the kinds of interventions that could reduce the various metrics that are associated with diabetes, and that's disease oriented research. And that can kind of be done at a distance. You get patient data, but you don't have to be next to the patient to study the effects. It's lab based. But the shift has been towards what's called patient-oriented data, patient-oriented research, in which what's examined is the conditions of use by the patient of the treatments and the experiences that patients have that might affect their uptake of the findings from disease-oriented research. And here's a good example. It's floating in the news this week. Saw it in the New York Times the other day. Research has demonstrated that if the medications that are given to an older heart patient are put in one pill that they can take at the same time, as opposed to take 6 different pills with 6 different medications, put it into one capsule, guess what? That improves their biological indicators. It improves their compliance with their treatment regimen. And that's what we call patient-oriented evidence. Now, I'd have you think about what would it take to have practice-oriented evidence that matters from the perspective of us as organizational researchers. So I still have this crazy thing on my slide. There we go. The issue is to have more practice-oriented evidence of the kind that's readily implementable. We need collaborations between thoughtful practitioners and open-minded academics. And that collaboration requires time. It takes time to sit with an organization or spend time making trips to different companies in an industry to understand the actual practice and the conditions of use. Practitioners need to be able to talk about and test their own assumptions, because as Mark Twain once said, it's not what we Did I blow that already? It's not what people don't know. It's what they believe that ain't true that is the problem in their decisions. And so the idea of being able to test the assumptions that practitioners have can be very informative. This process needs both rigor, good design, but it needs rich description, knowledge of the context. And that takes time to build. So I'm going to conclude with a tale. And the story I wanted to tell you about is the story of a partnership at Carnegie Mellon, my university, with General Motors. And this is a couple decades back, but I chose it to tell you because we know how it ended, and that's always nice. It's like American Graffiti, the movie. Where are they now? I can tell you. So in this collaboration, which was brokered by a research center at Carnegie Mellon, faculty from the business school, and representatives of General Motors got together to address a problem. The problem was, how do we figure out what the real costs of car production are so that we understand at different points in engineering and design or in production and final finish work, what the decisions we've made at various points accumulate to be in the cost of producing a car. This problem of figuring out the real costs of production required IT type people. It required accountants. It required engineers. It required organizational behavior people who understand about how to get people together to talk about these issues. The product of this collaboration was something that we know today as activity-based costing. It's a theory and a methodology. You might associate it with Robert Kaplan, who's now at Harvard. He was at the time at Carnegie Mellon. And at the presentation, this project went on a couple of years, data were gathered, information was created that were the assessments of the costs. They were shared with the different groups. They improved the methodology. The researchers came to understand the categories that the different people involved in production were using when they have allocated costs so they could come up with a clear consensus number. And at the public presentation, which was held in Mellon College of Science in about 20-something years ago, when they got up, the representatives from General Motors talked about the theory of activity-based costing. And the academics, the accountants, and the organizational behavior people talked about car production. As they had so gotten to the point of understanding each other's thought worlds, they could present the information derived from the other. The idea that the people with whom we work and collaborate can become broader and more expert, just as we become more broad and expert in the context of their work, I think is our golden ticket. It takes time. It takes focus. It produces many different kinds of studies, some of which are directly of interest to the company, some of which are our theory-based interest, but we have the time to develop a portfolio of work in the context of this relationship. And so I want to close by saying that I think one of the opportunities you and we have is to provide support so that our faculty, especially our junior faculty, can take the time to build these research relationships on a team with others where they can come to the point where what they know can be presented by the practitioner and what the practitioner understands can be deeply appreciated by the scholar who can go on and turn that into knowledge production. And on that note, I'm done.
Thank you, Professor Denise Russell. Yes, it is indeed, in order to build up trustworthy relationships that require time and effective communication. You mentioned young scholar, which means the senior scholar may not have time, or patience. Okay, that's very interesting. All right, and we're going to switch gear to hear some Asian perspective. Let's welcome Professor T.B. Roth.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure and privilege to be a part of this panel. I agree with each one of the earlier speakers. I'm totally in tune with them. Wonderful points have been made. I will focus more on the kind of experiences we have had, which almost support the kind of thoughts that the previous three speakers have mentioned. Very recently, I think the book is just out, is available on Amazon. Two of us wrote this book, Leaders in the Making. The most interesting part of this book was we identified 30 leaders who made a mark in different areas, largely HR leaders, and followed their crucible experiences by interviewing them, made stories, and identified leadership activities and competencies that they have demonstrated, values they demonstrated, and came up with a competency model and discovered this model is very similar to either the Michigan University model or CIPD model and other countries, the leadership models that have come up with. The most interesting part of our study is that I'm more from the academics, although I'm chairman of a company, consulting company for 25 years, but I've been in teaching field for 40 years. Arvind was a CEO of a company and later head of HR. So this is an indication of a joint work between a practitioner and an academic. And the most important thing that we're trying to do is to instigate and inspire academicians to get into the industry and write more and more case studies from logistics industry, from production industry, from finance, from entrepreneurship, from people belonging to different age groups and things like that. I think this is one good example of how industry and academics can collaborate through joint authorship. Another example is in my own case. I joined when we started the conceptualize the integrated human resource development for Larsen & Toubro, a famous engineering company. It's now global. In those days, it was more Indian, started by Danish engineers. We created an integrated HRD system and started disseminating this. The time I was a professor at IIM. And when we went to one of the companies, they said, look, why don't you help us to implement? I joined as a general manager in that particular organization for 1 full year, implemented the system. And that year of course, we implemented the system, but I learned a hell of a lot because that 1 year experience made a lot of difference in my own life. That gave rise to a lot of courses on HRD, organization development, as well as building others to promote human resources development. So this is one thing, I think the academicians taking a sabbatical year off, joining industry, and actually making things happen. So you are taking the concepts and putting them into the industry. A very interesting experience we have had at the Indian Institute of Management was actually one of our directors who was not even a PhD when he became director of our institute. After he completed his term, he actually voluntarily chose not to continue as the head of the institution. But he said management has to be taken to not only industry, from industry to rural development, education, and so on. So we went into rural areas in Rajasthan and worked with a group of villagers there and taught them new skills. Like I think you see the products in the picture. They didn't know how to make these kinds of products. They only were following traditional method of tanning leather. But the National Institute of Design joined hands with that. We went there, taught them, and they became a very enterprising organization. You can find them, their website, AJ, Javaja, Alliance Artisans, Javaja, and so on. I can send it. This is an illustration of how academics can do action research. The other day, Albert, we were talking about action research. I think this is a good example. So I think academic institutions should get involved in doing action research to demonstrate to industry, and I think it is possible. India, we very recently started, this may not be new entirely to the rest of the world, but we are promoting this professor of practice. Anybody who spends about 15-20 years in industry, you don't need to have a PhD. You can join the academics as a professor we call them as a professor of practice. Now, this gentleman you find in the picture is a professor of practice at the Indian School of Business, and he has recently written 2 books after he became a professor on human capital management, and he's creating quite a lot of ripples. So this is another good concept of creating professors of practice by academic institutions that can promote. The other point I like to mention is the PhDs. We started long ago an executive PhD program in which we believed that managers are sitting on bundles of data. If only they have research methods and writing skills, you develop these skills, they can use these very data and then contribute to management practice and so on. I think this is a thing that we started, but it has not picked up very much. But today, we have this Academy of Human Resource Development. In the last 15, 20 years, we have 40 fellows who were largely from industry, come there, spend some time, part-time, work on a thesis, and complete the PhD. The other trend I would very much encourage, and this is where I would appeal to universities, that you should open up the system from simply executive doctoral program to any person who has 15, 20 years of experience. You want to record all your experience and conceptualize. I think we teach them conceptualization, theory part of it, and then later help them to document it. You can see the wonderful kind of books and researches they come up with. So I would in fact recommend universities should open up. I think the main problem with university system is that they are pretty closed. They follow the rules, regulations, process, and in the name of rigor, what they do is they only follow a rigor which helps themselves, self-perpetuating kind of things like my earlier speaker said. The same is an issue with industry. Industry are quite reluctant to invite academics or send people on sabbatical to work on academics. Opportunities are phenomenal, but I think what is required is creating a open mindset. I think we have to work both with industry and academics to change their mindset. Why should an MBA be completed in 2 years? Why not 5 years? Every year you come for a month, do something, learn something, go back, practice it, and then write something. So over 6 years, you can complete about 15, 20 courses and you can get an MBA. Same way, doctorate. Why can't the doctorate be across 10 years? I think these are some of the models with which we need to work. And it is possible to build quite a bit of collaboration between both practitioners and the academicians. I think academicians need to open up their mind. I am personally very much against the FT ratings which overemphasize A-star journals, publications in A-star journals. What that does is that most of these journals are not read by practitioners. They are only read by a group of people who network among themselves. And most unfortunately, researchers are trying for high ranking in FT and other kind of agencies. So I think it's high time we change the ranking system. And in fact, I would recommend practitioners should come up with a journal in which reference is not to other academicians. Reference is by give it to another half a dozen practitioners who can read and say, yeah, I have learned something from it, that this is publishable. I think we need to change this outlook. Journals should now be published more by practitioners along with the academicians without losing the rigor and so on. So these are some thoughts. Opportunities are wonderful. Mindset needs to change. I think it is possible to bring a great change in the entire, I think, system now. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity for me. These are some thoughts.
Thank you, Professor T.V. Rao. You have very innovative ideas. I think by what you are saying, you promote the competence-based knowledge instead of degree diploma-based. Anyway, you combine both. All right, so we're going to continue invite Dr. Chulapong. She came from Thailand. Please.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Well, I could not agree less with Dr. Raul, because I was one of the executives who has been convinced to pursue my PhD at a later stage of my career. And I found it very worthwhile to do so. So on this occasion, I would like to share with everybody, my impression on the how can research improve business practice. And when I had to do this, I try to go back to the definition, and what I found very useful is the definition of best practice, the business best practice. And what it says is that it's the best way of working to achieve an organization business goals. But it also says that best practice also needs to be updated and measured to keep up with the latest system, methods, model applied by successful business leaders. So my point is that we really have to get closer to the business organization, especially at the top, in order to get more insights into their best practice. Because as you may know, doing PhD, sometimes you have to go back 10 to 20 years, looking at business models, best practices. But then what best practice 10 years ago may not be applicable to today in this VUCA world, when we have, this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, especially right after the pandemic. A research paper that was done 2 years ago, right before the pandemic, may become obsolete very fast. So my point is that the research that's based on, most of the research works based on historical data, which may not necessarily be applicable to the current situation and the future trends. Complicated strategic planning models, which take time to prepare and implement, probably have become less popular. For example, the BSC, the balanced scorecard model versus the OKR, the objective key results, the latter becomes more popular because, people become less patient, let's put it this way, with the new generation gap. In Thailand, we're talking about the average people, because we are developing country, right? The average Thai citizen reads only like 8 lines of books per year. Right now they said it's around 16 lines. So people become less patient with doing something that takes very long time. So we probably have to come with the new models and keep ourselves up to date. And most recently, we also have these ESG policy, or sustainable development goals, that the UN have come up with, and it has become very popular in the business communities. And we also have the concept of gender equality, diversity. So there is need for research to prove the positive impact, to convince executives and encourage business practice. Especially, we need to have the transfer of know-how from the big corporates to the, I would say, small and medium-sized enterprises. And in the country like Thailand, this has not been happening so much. We also see the change in the labor force, like we have this gig economy where you have people prefer to work part-time or acting as a freelancer rather than being permanent employee of a staff, working loyally for, until they retire for 30 or 40 years. This gig economy become more popular. So it raised the question of these human resource development tools, of even business models in the past, whether it's still valid, and how the business organization should cope with this. And this is something that, to get the latest update on what should be the best practice in the changing world, we need to get closer to the executives of these organizations. So what we need to have is to bridge the communication gap between the researchers and the business executives. Most often, I still remember when I told my boss that we are an international consulting firm, that I would like to use our company as the target for my PhD. And the first answer that he told me was no, cannot. And that's probably some misconception about disclosing information to the public that make people scared of trying to do so. So actually also because they don't understand how they can contribute greatly to the society by sharing their knowledge or best practices to the others. What I have come up with is just an idea, especially for developing countries, is that an effective way to get involved in executive is to get involved in certain executive programs sponsored by the government or private organizations. In Thailand, we do have this National Defense College that offer various courses for executive. We also have Capital Market Academy, which is sponsored by the Stock Exchange of Thailand. Also have offer this program which take 6 to 12 months for all executive for various part of the business, including politicians, including academicians, to join hands and become cooperative on coming with something that could contribute to the society. And I think this would also be helpful, especially for the academician and especially PhD students when they do not know which topics would be the topics of interest. And what we can have is the researchers can also gain an insight into the best and most up-to-date business practices, because you need to know someone in order to, someone means some top executives in order for them to share their insight with you. But if you just go into individual organization and say, hey, I want to interview you, what's your best practice or something, they probably shy away from sharing this information with you. So getting close to these programs, I think would be very helpful and also would help with the transfer of the know-how or the application of the best practices from the large corporations to the SME, small and medium-sized enterprises. And I could cite some examples, like when we interview Toyota Thailand on their secrets, to the success. And one of the top executives told me that they use this concept of 5 whys to determine the root cause of the problem or defect. And we're trying to get into more details into how you use it, because just learning from theory doesn't mean you can apply it more effectively. And simply because we are good friends in this Capital Market Academy class, we got the explanation and examples, some very valuable insights from him. Okay, and that could lead to effective quantitative and qualitative research, as opposed to contacting individual organizations by ourselves. And this example was, the paper that we did 2 years ago, just right before the COVID-19 pandemic, for this Capital Market Academy class 30. So we had set up a research team consisting of 9 people out of these 95 executive students in the class. We did survey questionnaire and responses on the topic of shaping people for business sustainability. And we use the word in action. That means, it's not just theory, we also put into practice and interview how people apply certain tools in real life. And we did both quantitative and qualitative methods. We did the survey questionnaire and got the responses from 921 executives. from the government and business organization, and we got that within 2 weeks, which is very fast. We conducted structured interview, on the 15 entities in various sizes, including corporates, universities, non-profit organizations, and we did the publication on it. But having said that, younger generation, they don't like long reports. So we also did a podcast through the program that listened by various executives and turned out to be very, very helpful. Going forward, after this pandemic, we're going to an updated version, and that's what I'm doing it right now. And the program could be expanded to cover other countries in the region. For example, this program that I mentioned offered by the Stock Exchange of Thailand. Other than this program that offered to the Thai executives, the Stock Exchange also have this Capital Market Academy program for the Greater Mekong sub-region. That means for countries in the ASEAN country as well. And in terms of money, where should the money come from? To support the research works, the Stock Exchange also set up this Thailand Capital Market Development Fund. So it supports the development of the capital market, and at the same time, it provides this first-class education and research to further the higher education. So if we need support from these organizations, I think it is available. And other institutions such as the National Defense College also ask their students to come up with the research work, Thailand going forward, for example, or even the Thai Energy Academy also talking about how we can use energy to energy literacy, how could we use that to develop the world. Also, the Board of Trade and Commerce also have this top executive program. So various programs attended by executives who have the hands-on experience, but less time. I think if we can collaborate with the researchers on the topics of interest and assist them in working out the research that would be valuable to the society, I think that would be the best way of collaboration between these parties. And that's the end of my presentation. Back to Dr. Lee.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chulapon. She is old veteran practitioner and young scholar. He just demonstrated after he got a PhD and he conducted very huge, big impact research. We would love to see your outcomes. Is this still going on?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now we're going to turn the floor to Professor Sinsitki.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I have the pleasure of building on a number of fascinating presentations, and what I will try to do is highlight some perspectives that have come out of our experience. One of the groups that I'm involved with is the Behavioral Science and Policy Association, which tries to do much of what the other speakers have talked about as well, but it's broader than management and business. It's about the behavioral and social sciences more generally and how they can relate to public and private sector policy implementation. And I'll highlight a couple of the insights that we've gotten from our experience. First thing I would like to highlight is the good news is there has been a lot of interest in what we're all talking about. There are many books here. Some of these come from some of our speakers today, some from others. But the idea is that there is a real appetite for what we're trying to advocate for. And what we need is tools and institutional mechanisms that make it easier for people to do that and that remove some of the barriers that have already been discussed. What here we go. So one of the things I always like to highlight in introducing this is economists have actually done this much more effectively than people in the behavioral and social sciences outside of that. For example, in some of the work we've done, we found that behavioral economics was behind us in the beginning and is now taking actually much of the work that we've done and doing a better job of getting it into practice than we have. Even though I used to, many years ago, describe them as amateur psychologists and amateur sociologists, they've become the ones who are able to actually convince people to use this information. Why do they do that? One is they trade, and this builds on something Denise was talking about before, they trade in field data more than we do and natural experiments. I'm not going to go into the details on all these slides. I'm going to hit the high points because many of my colleagues here have already raised a number of these issues. The second is they communicate a simpler worldview, which is very helpful because a practitioner wants to know, how do I use this? Not give me the 25 variations on it and 3 weeks of qualifications, but tell me what the best practice is right now based on your expert judgment. The third is they're more willing than academics coming from many of our disciplines to put themselves in positions to actually use their expertise in practice. And many of my colleagues have already talked about the value of that. If you look at many of the government organizations, business organizations, think tanks, and so forth, there are many disciplines represented, but economists have stepped up to those policy applications more than psychologists, sociologists, and so forth. Now, so what are some of the challenges that we're facing? You'll see from the 3 main points here, the first 2 points are there is a desire. Researchers, even top academic researchers, has expressed a real interest in doing this, in having their research have more impact. Public and private sector policymakers and practitioners have expressed a real interest, and they're under pressure to ground their decisions in more of a rigorous base than has been the case historically. However, as my colleagues have already raised, in many ways, the system puts pressure against doing that. The incentives tend not to work for it. There is a lack of translational research training for social scientists. So it's not that they lack the ability, but they lack the knowledge and skill. We give them extensive training in how to do advanced statistical methods, but we don't give them training in how do they express what they've learned in simple, straightforward terms, for example. And I would go even further. Bill, for example, you talked about the disincentives for this. I would go that it's not just that we don't have the incentives, we're actually actively discouraged from doing this. We all know of some colleagues who have not only been great at fundamental science, but have been great at practical implications of that work. And often they're disparaged for that, for the second part, not for the first part. Similarly, in business practice, while there is a desire and there is some pressure to ground what you do in more evidence, the pressure to do things quickly, to have difficulty finding where that evidence is, and so forth. And most recently, skepticism about the rigor and the value of rigorous science has entered into the public discussions, and that undermines this effort as well. The bottom line is for both researchers and practitioners, there is a lack of an infrastructure that helps them do this well. And that's many of us on this panel have been actively trying to rectify that situation, make it easier to find information, easier to find assistance, more readily built-in infrastructure that makes that all work more in a more straightforward way. So what are ways that we can try to overcome this? Some are conceptual and some are more practical. I'm not going to reiterate this because it's been said many times on this panel already, is either or approaches are not helpful. Either research or practice is not the solution. The most interesting research questions, in my view, are the ones that bridge this divide. The most valuable practical advice comes from bridging this divide. It either or is not the solution. We can overcome that. The second is to recognize, actually, my colleague Craig Fox, he and I founded this Behavioral Science and Policy Association, wrote an article, and one of the arguments that we made is if you use a metaphor of a bridge between academics and practitioners, what we often forget is bridges go in both directions. We need to take the research and put it into practice, but we also need to take the interesting problems and insights and solutions that work, even though we may not have the theory to explain why they work. And we need to draw those into the research and find out what is really known. And going back to the Mark Twain quote that Denise mentioned, what is really known and what is it we think we know that is really wrong. The third point is we need to overcome the paradox of deep understanding. And that's both on the research side and on the practice side. Practitioners deeply know their situation. Researchers deeply know their particular area of expertise. The problem is when that's the case, it becomes much harder to step back and see the forest for the trees, for the practitioners to help researchers know what is needed that can be done helpfully, for researchers to know what can be communicated in a way that practitioners can actually use. One of the things I've learned in being co-editor-in-chief of the journal that BSPA has is that some of our best, most thoughtful, most knowledgeable scholars have an impossible time communicating what they know in a way that is useful to practitioners. They get mired in the details and they can't step back and say, what's the essential point here? And you would think these are really smart experts that they would be able to do that. But there is a real problem. And I think this is something that is part of the educational liability that we have right now. We do not train PhD students in how to write so those outside of their narrow area of expertise can actually understand what they're talking about or why it matters. And so some of the solutions we've come up with we actually, in our journal, we have a team of writing editors. So once a paper is accepted, it gets turned over to this team. It's not like Harvard Business Review, where HBR says, thank you very much, we'll take your paper now and do whatever we want with it. This is done with the scientists to make sure it is really accurate, but is helping them express their points in a way that is more accessible. But there are promising new developments. This panel highlighted a number of them. As I mentioned, scholars have accepted that this is an important issue. There are a number of institutional vehicles that have been created. I just mentioned a few here. Behavioral Insights team started in the UK and is now around the world. The US created a behavioral science team to advise the top government. The United Nations has done the same thing. OECD, the World Bank. We've been working with a lot of these organizations over the years. It's hard to find a lot of leading corporations that haven't started behavioral science units within their corporation. And there are a number of nonprofit organizations. Denise has created the Center for Evidence-Based Management, Social Science Research Center, the Center for the Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences. There are a number of groups around the world, and there are associations of scientists who have been interested in doing this. Our Behavioral Science and Policy group is just one, but many have done this as well. So there are the beginnings of these infrastructures that can really provide the platform for the directions that we've all been talking about. BSPA, just a brief word about that in closing. was designed to facilitate, to bring together scientists, practitioners of the science, and organizations to translate rigorous work in a way that can be used, providing infrastructure, but really making a point of not duplicating what others are doing, but to support what others are doing through publications, through events, through resource sharing. Again, in conclusion, what are our lessons learned? We need more reward for field data and natural experiments. For example, in our journal, we have a dual review process. So every article is reviewed not only by disciplinary experts, but by policy experts, to make it more accessible, to gain attention from those who can use it, and to build communities that include both scientists and practitioners, so that together we're identifying and trying to address the kinds of problems we've all been talking about. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sim-Sitkin. This is great. Out of this, all 6 excellent presenters presenting your thoughts and your experience. The last one is very much in depth. We are talking about the policy and impact. I will get this back to Dr. Matt Marsting, because he is working at a UN level. This is a global level. So what can we do?
Yes, I'm
through your organization. I'm sorry.
Yes, no, thank you so much. So what can we do? Could you please rephrase the last part of your question? Thank you.
Yes, we have so much energy and business model, and how can we work with global compact to have more impact in terms of policy building or collaboration with, you have more than probably close to 1,000 business schools and millions of volunteers. And we have, we have energy here, and we want to do this bigger.
Yes, no, thank you very much. And thank you very much for this all these very inspiring comments. I've really enjoyed listening into every single presenter here and professor. I think that there is this call for the urgent need, and I really like the bridging metaphor that Dulapon and Sim bring along here, the bridging metaphor, and remembering that this is a two-way road, as Sim puts it. It's not just us going out, as Dulapon put it, getting the interviews, collecting the data, and then publish, but we also need to think about, how do we give back? How do we provide a kind of a two-way street? And I think that is probably, and this has already been said many times, this is probably one of the challenges. And I think that this has been coming back to Bill's comment and your last slide, Bill, about how can we, for example, Prime, for example, RRBM, representing, education, representing research, how can we actually strengthen our forces together? Because we supplement each other in what we actually want to do. We want to promote research-based education. And again, right now, for me, being in New York in the Global Compact office on a daily basis, we have 15,000 businesses here signed up to the UN Global Compact's Sustainable Development Goals, working with them on a daily basis. And they are inviting us to do research on particular issues. For example, there is I think there's a lot of opportunities that we need to explore much better. For example, there is a really interesting project on science-based targets. There's another really interesting program on sustainable finance. There's another program on gender equality and oceans, etc. But none of these programs are, they're very much oriented towards changing the world, transforming the society, but none of them are followed by a research project. So I think it's a matter of us, you could sort of say, knocking on the door and opening the perspective of that this is actually not just a one-way road, us collecting data, but that there's also value for businesses engaging in these practical orientations or practical programs, valuing them to partner with us as management scholars. So I think, and that comes back to some of your points about us sort of being able to more evidence the kind of value there is for engaging with us. And Rao, I think that from your examples from India and the professors of practice, I think that there is something we may want to explore and articulate even more in terms of what is it that these professors of practice actually bring to the table that businesses value so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Morsi. And we still got 14 minutes, 13 minutes.
I would say, yeah, we have
Yeah.
about 13 minutes left. I don't know if you want to open it up to questions. There were some folks earlier on that were raising their hands. There may be some
Sure.
questions out there.
Sure, Albert, you're in charge. You are monitoring audience questions. So you
I'm
can
in
pick
charge.
2 or 3 questions.
Okay, so if there was individuals that had raised their hands earlier, if you want to send chats to us now, we'll start to take your questions and I can field them to the panel here. There was one, I think, Matt, I think you responded already to the question earlier, right? Okay. So
Yes,
there was one.
I put in the chat my response. So there is a link now to these UNESCO, you know, one in 3. Where did I get the data from? So please take a look at the chat. Thank you.
Maybe I'll cut and paste it and put it in the big chat room here. How's that? Is that correct? Right. Okay. Any other? I'm not seeing any hands raised or questions popping up in the chat boxes. Earlier on, there was a flurry of them, you know, hands raising and some questions back and forth.
Okay, that would be great. That would give us the opportunity. We can have really a roundtable discussion now.
Okay.
So one quick comment about sort of, I really see that there's a very broad scale movement towards more responsible research, towards more evidence-based. You know, I think we have a lot of people trying to move in the right direction. The incentives are not yet aligned and still a lot of problems, but I feel like there is a good deal of movement. And with regard to the Financial Times ranking, in the next session here, Andrew Jack will be talking, and he is really the guy that runs the Financial Times ranking. And he has been very open to try and come up with other metrics that put much greater emphasis on societal impact. But the challenge is coming up with a credible metric that we'll all be satisfied with, that really does look at the impact. So he's very open to ideas. He's done a number of profiles and stories on the importance of responsible research and creating this impact. So I think there's hope, but we need some more clever minds to think about how to make that happen.
Yes, that is a good question. Last year, we invited one of the representatives from Financial Times talking about how they advocate what kind of research and how they rank, you know, universities, whatever. But I don't know who can have impact to that. What can we do? But I think in reality, go ahead.
Andrew Jack is really the focal person there.
Okay.
If we can help him create the right metric,
okay,
will happen. He's already he's following to some extent what AACSB has done, which is to encourage folks to tell their story in more of a narrative format, to talk about societal impact, which is similar to what the Brits have done with the REFS exercise, where they do look at the impact of the research.
And I can say from our side in Prime, we are trying to work with, you know, every second year, all the 800 plus schools who have signed up with Prime are asked or committed to deliver a report on their work with responsible management, education and research and partnerships. So this is a wonderful, I think, underexplored gem of information about what do we actually do in our management schools, in our business schools in this space. What we're trying to do now is to, you know, we're reviewing that report to make it a little bit more towards some indicators, because it, you know, every school can report on what they like, you could say, and that's wonderful. But we also would like some indicators so we can actually push the agenda a little bit more and also be a little bit better individually schools, but also at a global level, even at a regional level, to account for the kind of societal impact that we actually have locally, regionally, globally. So I think that is another part, and of course ASCSB and RRBM is working with us on this journey. So I agree with Bill that there's a, you know, the ecosystem is sort of working with us to help this, or to at least try to help this and contribute to this journey. And I have to say, I thought, Sim, what you said about the behavioral economics, I'll look more into that. I think that's really interesting how they have managed to transform, you could sort of say, the research to actually have that impact very much more articulated than before.
We have one person raise their hand. If I could get to the crowd. Hadia, did you want to? You should be able to ask the question if you unmute yourself. I'm not sure if they're going to ask the question up, but give them the opportunity to ask.
If I could quickly comment on what Meta just said, I think you know, if we use the behavioral economists as an example, we should be looking around for who has solved in a small or a large way the kinds of problems we're talking about, and just, you know, shamelessly copy what's worked for others. You know, we don't have to invent these things, but if others have figured out how to do it, then that's a pretty good pathway for us to follow, because we do have the knowledge. We're just not getting people to use it. And you know, I think a lot of it is our fault. Now, I do think the flip side of it, I did mention one thing. Oh, I forgot to mention this actually, and what I was saying is, I think another failing in education is that we make excuses all the time about how practitioners can't read the research, and that it's our fault we're not making it accessible. I think that's absolutely true. The other thing, though, is we're not educating them to read the research. Physicians read medical research. Engineers read engineering research. Why is it that people who go through business schools should not be able to read the business research? And so in some sense, we're pandering in multiple directions. We're pandering to our fellow scientists that they shouldn't have to do the hard work to figure out how to make what they're doing accessible. And we're pandering to practitioners and the practitioners we're training through our programs to say, oh, reading that research is just too hard. They're smart enough. If we give them the training, they should be able to access that. And I think in both directions, we need to just step up and fight those battles.
If I might build on that, I wanted to link that point, something Bill said, with Meta's point, and that is how we educate, what expectations we create on the part of our business students. And the point was raised, and I think Bill made it earlier, that incentives need to be aligned.
Yeah.
Beyond yes. And then there's an and the and is, what about socialization and identity? How do we think of ourselves as people who are business professionals, people who have a management education, for-profit, non-profit, whatever? How do our students and our graduates identify with regard to their profession? Sim made the point, you know, doctors read medical journals. Doctors also, and nurses, participate in research all the time. Right. It's part of the give back and part of the ethos of being a clinician is to generate research or be a part of research in addition to consume research products. That ethos is, I think, missing in the way in which we educate business management undergraduates and graduate students. And it's weird, because why wouldn't a profession seek to promote its knowledge base in its graduates over time by helping them participate in research? Design, participate, doesn't matter. It's engagement. Mm-hmm. But there's a point that Sim raised, I think, is really relates to this. The idea that consuming research, in addition to helping to produce it as part of what a management professional would do, I think is a very fundamental capability that is low-hanging fruit to us, and we haven't reached for it and plucked it. Actually, because I'm teaching evidence-based management and change management from an evidence-based perspective, all my students read the research in areas of their interest. I let them choose. There's some things I guide them to, then I let them choose. And then they present in class on what the research is on the balanced scorecard or financial incentives or you name it, doesn't matter. But the point is they learn how to read a research article. How do you read a research article? First, don't read the whole damn thing. If you are a practitioner, you read its face, you read its abstract, quick read through the front end, dot your have your eyes roll through the method section so you know how they designed it, and then the punchline at the end. This you can do in 10 minutes in the most complicated paper. And if they learn to do that and get comfortable reporting back on what they've learned from that, it's not so daunting.
Mhm.
But if you remember what it was like first time you read an academic paper, you with a PhD, you went, oh my God, have I chosen the wrong field? So, that reaction to reading research, we can mitigate by helping them learn to do it.
I just want to say, I love this conversation. Thank you.
It takes some mentoring, right? It takes some mentoring from us to our students early on at the undergraduate level, graduate level, and beyond. I think we're getting close, unfortunately. Time goes by fast.
Yeah, 2 minutes left. It is amazing we have all the thought leaders gathered together. This is just the beginning. Even this is not new topics, but at least we identify education should take more responsibility to how to educate our students. Even we want them to become the future leader, but in terms of research and the knowledge, I think university and professors should take more responsibility. And there should be a standard. How can we cultivate and evaluate the student upon our expectation? Whose expectation? AACSB or each individual schools? And also we need to win practitioner enterprises trust to allow our young scholar and our student, graduate students, to conduct research in their enterprise. And also the policy, I think, is more important. How to guide the research. This is one of the key aims for IFSAM, as IFSAM is a scholarly association. And most of us are scholars. Some of us are practitioners with 2 roles. But we would like to develop policies how we can make education, practice, and research work together. So what kind of a policy we can come up with?
Can I make one point that I think you raised a really important issue, Lee, but I want to highlight it, which is we also have a more aspirational role here, which is there is an erosion of trust in science. There is an erosion of trust in the foundations of certain business practices. And by bringing together the appropriate research evidence with practice, we have an obligation, I think, to try to achieve better trust in both types of institutions through the joining of this effort. I think independently, both are weaker than they are when they're together. And that is one of the mechanisms for addressing the erosion of trust issue that's pervasive across the world today.
Yeah, I think that's one of your expertise. We don't have time to learn from you. We definitely want to find other time. But we are fortunately to have all of you, the thought leaders, and to have brainstorming together. And the time is up. We have to dismiss this wonderful group. Okay. See you in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day wherever
Thank
you're
you
at.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Thanks. Well, we could say that the webinar here is closed. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Aye.